Shabbat Shalom. Let's study Torah together. It's Parshat Chukat this week, and the very famous episode of Moses hitting the rock and receiving the serious consequence of not being allowed to go into the land of Israel is given to him by God. And so let's explore that story, and let's try to put it into perspective. Let's ask the two central questions about it. Of course, does he really deserve that punishment is probably one that's on everyone's mind every generation. And secondly, and more specifically to the commentary, we'll look at what exactly was his sin. The context is important, and this doesn't give him the total pass, but it does help us understand Moses' actions later on when it comes to hitting the rock and how he speaks to the children of Israel. The first verse in chapter 20 sets the scene. And what's the scene? What's the reality that we're dealing with? Not necessarily right away do we hear that the children of Israel are thirsty. We hear more about Moses' state of mind and, frankly, his grief. And we empathize with him, having suffered an incredible loss. The first verse of chapter 20 of Numbers says that Vayavohu v'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar tzin. They get to midbar tzin, and vatamot sham Miriam, and Miriam dies there. Vatikaver sham, and she's buried. And of course, this is a devastating loss for Am Yisrael, and particularly for Aaron and Moses, who was so connected to Miriam. We know from the very first chapters of the book of Exodus. And so it's in that context that this story of Moses' hitting the rock takes place. And so I like to always remember that it's connected to this time of great grief and deep, deep human turmoil and suffering that we know comes with loss. And yet, the Torah is, I think, telling us and explaining that sometimes, though our losses are so profound, and we wish not to continue in life the way that now reality is defined, we sometimes have to find the strength to go do our jobs, our leadership roles in this world. And so it is with the situation here. Immediately, the people come and complain about there being no water. It didn't mention Shiva. It didn't mention Shloshim. It didn't mention time to retreat and gather and for people to come and give words of comfort, blessings to Moses and Aaron. It just said they came and there was no water and they gathered against Moses and Aaron. I imagine there was some space in there, or I want to kind of sense the notion that from other times of loss, when it says that Abraham cried and that there was such deep emotion vis-a-vis losses in our ancestors' lives, that, of course, people gave a little bit of space to their leaders. But perhaps here the Torah is making a comment about timing that we need to take into consideration. Sometimes we don't consider the states of mind and states of being of those who we need to make requests from, and the leaders we need to challenge, and what's going on in their personal lives we dismiss. And so it was that they gathered against Moses and Aaron, and hopefully it wasn't during Shiva, and hopefully it wasn't during Shloshim. But the people quarreled, and they spoke up. If only we had perished as our brethren perished before us. And this is, of course, the very end of the 40 years now. We're in a new context as well. The very first event in the context of now what's happening in year 39, 40, before the end of the whole story here in the desert, is that Miriam died and they lacked water. And there's still a lack. And there's still confrontation. And it happened right away, and the people are gathered against Moses and Aaron, and they go to God for some advice. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God gives the instruction. I'm reading in verse 7 now of chapter 20 in Numbers. Kach et hamateh, take your staff, v'hakel et ha'edah, bring the community together, ata v'aharon achicha, you and Aaron your brother, v'dibartem el hasela, and speak to the rock. Le'einehem, before them all, in front of their eyes. V'natan meimav, and then it will give its water. V'hotzeita lehem mayim min hasela, v'hishkita et ha'edah v'et be'iram. And this way you'll bring water for them, the entire people, and their animals. So Moses does what God says. Vayikach Moshe et hamateh milifnei Adonai. He takes his staff and he comes and he goes from before God. Ka'asher tzivahu, exactly as God had commanded. But did he do exactly as God commanded? Here is the big verse, verse 10 in chapter 20. Vayakilu Moshe v'Aharon et hakahal el pnei hasala. Moses and Aaron bring the people around the rock. Vayomer lahem, and he says to them, wait a minute, let's reread that. Vayomer lahem. Oh, it could have said Vayomer el Hasela or Vayidaber el Hasela, because God commanded him to speak to the rock. But instead it says Vayomer lahem. He spoke to the people. Shimuna hamorim. He tells them, listen up, you bitter people, you bitter souls. Hamin ha'asela hazeh notzi lechem mayim. Shall we draw water from this rock for you? Vayarem Moshe et yado, and Moses lifted his hand. Vayach et hasela, and he hit the rock. B'matehu, with that staff, pa'amayim, twice. And we know the end of the story. God says, you're not going into the land. Lama lo ha'emantem bi. In verse 12, you didn't believe in me. Lahakdisheni le'enei b'nei Yisrael, to sanctify me in the eyes of all the children of Israel. God says, when you would not sanctify me, you made a big mistake. That's the Peshat of the Torah. And he says, Lo taviu et hakahal hazeh el haaretz asher natati lahem. You will not bring this people to the land that I have given them. Now we feel for Moses, and it's in our right to say, does Moses really deserve this based on what he did? And of course, that is the consequence. And this, I think, the straightforward answer to answer it on this pshat level of the text is that God is ready to give consequences when the plan does not go according to God's commands. And if Moses is the one that has to be made the exemplar, then for us, we should have a little bit more awe and fear and even love of God and respect for God. And we should do things according to the way God commands. And how do people get away with all of what they get away with? And God doesn't mete out any consequences? Well, again, the simple sense of it, addressing that is to say that once we really felt that it was so unjust to be so demanding and so exacting, the letter of the law of Moses, maybe God makes space for us to make a few adjustments. And unfortunately, that leaves space for wrongdoers and even evildoers to act according to their own free will. So what I would like to explore in a little bit more depth is not that question, but the question of, so what did he really do? And what is the sin? Because various commentators have suggested different approaches. We've been studying Ramban, Nachmanides. We're going to get to him. In the same theater of the globe and around the same time period, the Abravanel, who we studied 2 years ago, this commentator from Spain, suggested that Aaron's sin, he didn't make it into the land either, really was with the golden calf. And Moshe's sin was really not about the rock at all. This was the public place where he showed his anger and he hid it instead of speaking to it, so God could use this as the pretext to really punish him for what he deserved punishment for. And that was when he commanded the spies to go spy out the land. He added, wrongfully, a dimension to give them an open door to bring back a bad report, a report of evil, and that the land was too scary and that the job was too big and that they could never fulfill the mission. When Moses said, go bring me back a report and tell me the tov v'ra, instead of just kind of sending them out and bringing back the reports about which roads and paths they should take to go and conquer the cities they needed to, and which lands they should inhabit first to grow the first crops, and make the plans according to all that was potential there, and also bring back a report of how incredible it was and how luscious the fruit looked, so the people would be excited. He added the word, you should also bring me back the Ra. And in their haste to see themselves as grasshoppers and as nothing, and give power to the natives by transferring on to the natives a sense of authority and power over them, and that the Jews took this as an opportunity to retreat and say, no, we can't. We'll never achieve what God's plan calls for. This was actually Moses' fault and not the spies themselves. And for that, Moses was really punished and included in the punishment of the first generation of the wilderness. Very interesting approach by the Abravanel. And of course, calls the question can be raised, calls us to consider what kind of instructions should and could leaders have in order to go define the positive visions about what needs to be done and get done, and how and when do we include the willingness to criticize, to notice what is really the great challenge, and how much despair will we allow the challenges to really inform our approaches to fulfilling the missions in front of us. So given that, let's now go to Rashi and Ramban. Rashi and Ramban disagree about a fundamental answer to the question of what was Moses' sin in terms of that which we learn in verse 10 of chapter 20. So after Moses and Aaron bring the people together before the rock, Moses says, Vayomer lehem, he says to them, Shimu na hamorim. When he says, you listen up, you bitter pills, you complainers, just like your parents, this new generation, when he wags his finger and he lays into them, that was his ultimate sin. He spoke from a place of, as the Rambam will say it in Shmona Prakim, his commentary that agrees with this line of thinking that Rashi brought forward, he, out of anger, really chastises them and overdoes it, and God says, you still haven't learned? That's no way to be the master teacher. That's no way to be the leader we need. You've now ceded your place as leader of the generation who will go into the land. You're unable now to lead them into the land I promised. And so it was through his harsh words. And Ramban sees the last part of the verse as where Moses really sins. So yes, he had a problem with his harsh words. He might not have started there. He might have said Vayomer El Hasela. He might have spoken to the rock. But really, what's the big problem? What was the major sin? Moses said, Notzi lachem mayim, that we will be the ones to bring the water out of the rock for you, not God. And when they take that power for themselves, they deny God's existence and they sin as they have not sinned before when it comes to miracles. Rambam will disagree with the Rambam. So Nachmanides disagrees with Maimonides, and ultimately Rashi, he says, "V'hakatuv lo siper klal sheka'as ki shimuna hamorim tochachat." It really is not about the anger of that first line, and when he calls the people bitter. V'hakarov min ha'devarim shene'emru b'zeh, and the Perush that I like the best, the commentary I like the best, Ramban says, is Hem Divrei Rabbeinu Chananel Zichrono Levracha, is Rabbeinu Chananel's Torah, his commentary on this. It's always good to quote your teachers and to quote your sources in Jewish tradition, and the Ramban does that quite often as he explores the various commentaries on any given verse that he really wants to explore and disagree with and then bring his own. And here he brings Rabbeinu Chananel's commentary that scholars think used to be in a book form or in a manuscript form, and we've lost it. Rabbeinu Hananel had obvious Torah commentary, or maybe it was just oral traditions. And he said, Shekatav ki hachethu, the sin was when Amaram, when they said, Notzi lachem mayim, that we will be the ones to bring water, minasela, that from that rock. V'chein b'chol hanisim Yodi'um ki Hashem ya'aseh mehem lahafli. With other miracles, in fact, Moses and Aaron had attributed all of the miraculous work to God. But here, it didn't happen that way. And if they could have only, with this next generation, the second generation, created space for them through words, and this time not hitting the rock, because remember back in Exodus, he did hit the rock, and he was asked to hit the rock to get water. Here, if he would have only through loving words, words of instruction that seem to be like words that would help God's presence unfold when he spoke to the rock, and then they would see a miracle happen of water coming from the stones. If he could have only done that, he would have provided a foundation of recognizing God as the great worker of the miraculous, even if it was inherent in the nature, even if it was built into the fabric of the natural terrain, the geographical phenomenon of water and stratified rock in the desert that they uncapped, or somehow that he could just through words gently brush that aside in whatever way that was going to happen, so that God would then finish the job and provide the water coming out of those fountainous rocks. It would have provided the basis for them to sense the miraculous in nature, sense the God of their fathers and mothers making miracles happen for them too. And because Moses, along with Aaron, did not create that kind of foundation, it didn't provide this basis or this foundation of seeing the miracle in the everyday. And of course, we're trying to see that each day of our lives. In Jewish tradition, we say in the Modim prayer in the Amidah, we recognize the everyday miracles. Nisecha kol yom imanu, your miracles, God, that are every day with us. How often do we miss seeing the miraculous in what we're experiencing? How often do we miss sensing the miraculous in these very moments when we're sitting in front of a screen and thinking about technology? Maybe we sense that a little bit more because this has been our connective bridge that we needed in this time of the coronavirus. But what of the miracles of the societies we've built, the potential that comes along with the education that's delivered? What if, when we sense that there were complaints and the entire people gathered against the leadership, what if we sensed the miraculous possibility of providing for the thirst and the hunger, for the moral education, and for the advancement, and for the continuing the journey that must occur if we are to forge forward? So that really is Ramban's kind of observation, that they did not achieve the kind of founding a next generation on recognizing the miraculous in nature and in the everyday, and that they could indeed continue along on their journey to inherit the land that lie before them, that was promised to them and their ancestors. Hope you have some thoughts about Moses and Aaron in this chapter, about their deserving this consequence or not, about what the particular nature of their sin and how they missed the mark really is. I would love to hear your thoughts or read them in an email. So after Shabbat, drop me a line and let's continue to study together in through the weeks to come. Shabbat Shalom, and sweet study of Torah to each of you.